Great. Well, welcome everyone to this full auditorium, and Martin Salter, who's talking to us this evening. Welcome to everyone on Zoom, to the Royal Photographic Society. Thank you for joining us this evening, and thank you to the Photobook Collective for supporting this talk and presenting a range of monthly speakers in and amongst the book books that we have outside. And I would just like to start by saying we do have copies of Martin's book here this evening, so do feel free to purchase a copy before you leave. And then finally, I'd just like to say a few words about the RPS before I introduce our speaker this evening. The Royal Photographic Society has been here since 2019. We have an exhibition space upstairs, so do go and see the exhibition. We have a big photo book fair in partnership with the Martin Parr Foundation next door on the 8th and 9th of October. So do come back and see that. There's over 60 publishers who are presenting works, everyone from the big names right the way through to small independent publishers. That's Bob. That's his books on photography, so come back for that and have a look and see what else is around. And we have a whole series of public talks during BOP as well. And the Photo Book Collective will also be presenting their artists, photographers, as well as books during the event too. So thank you for that. So it's a real pleasure this evening to present Martin Salter to you. Martin's a photo book collector, and from the conversation we've just been having before the audience came in, then I know you're in for a real treat this evening and a very informative discussion around photo books, collecting, and Martin's own work. So Martin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you for all coming, and thank you all out there on the internet for joining me today. Basically, the talk's going to kind of I want the opportunity for you to be able to ask questions at the end, so I'm going to allow sort of 20 minutes for the first part of the talk, 20 minutes for the second, and 20 minutes for questions. So hopefully I'll time it correctly, but if not, there'll be more time for questions. So please feel free to ask anything you like at the end. So this is the first book that I ever owned, and it was bought for me for Christmas in 1986 by my wife. I just spent 3 months in South America, in Peru, while I was a student at university, and that was the kind of key moment where I thought, well, maybe this is something I could do. I could become a photographer when I graduate. I didn't study photography. I studied political science and philosophy, and I just thought, okay, this could be good. My photos, by the way, from that trip were not very good. I think there's 3 or 4 that I was quite pleased with. And what I wanted to say was, at this time, it was very, very difficult to get any information other than kind of how-to books on photography. You go to the local library, there'd be some, kind of generalist kind of books that you could access, but there were very, very few kind of monographs by key photographers at that time. So the only way you could find out about photography, really, for me, living in the suburbs of the south of England, was to either look at current magazines, newspapers, the occasional show in London. So I was completely naive about what the possibilities of photography were. So, and that was kind of refreshing, actually, to be honest, but that's where the big journey began. And so I graduated and went straight off, like many young people in that time, went to India. And I thought it would be quite nice to show these pictures at the beginning of the talk, because they're very different from the pictures towards the end. And these are some early, rather dodgy scans, so apologise for the dust spots, but some early photographs that I took with just responding to what I was coming across. I spent quite a long time up in the northwest part, Himalayas in India, in a place called Ladakh, and this is a young lad delivering cooking oil to one of the shops in the back streets of Leh in Ladakh. This is the bridge at Agra. So some quite kind of traditional kind of reportage style images. I wasn't really technically very adept, so a lot of the pictures that I took on long lenses, I didn't realize that you had to shoot at the shutter speed that was equivalent to the focal length of the lens. So I was thinking, oh, you can shoot a 30th of a second on a 300mm lens. No, you can't, unless you've got a very steady hand. So sadly, 50% of the pictures that I took were not great, but some of them came out, and I kind of began to. This picture here was when I began to really fall in love with photography and its possibilities, because this is what I saw, but this is what I saw as a photograph. And I think that's the key thing about people's love of photography, is it's not how the world actually looks, it's how it looks when you photograph it, and how it's frozen in that moment, but just how it is forever, not how it was then. And I still have this photo hanging on my wall in the house, and I think it was a point where I thought, actually, I kind of get this. And this image here, and a kind of more traditional very traditional kind of black and white reportage. Anyway, I came back from India full of enthusiasm, and I thought, right, I'm going to become a photographer. So I applied for a job I saw advertised in the British Journal of Photography, wanted photographer, court photographer, Old Bailey. So I went along to this interview with these pictures that I've just shown you, and the guy flicked through them and he said, yeah, these are great, but can you chase a van and point the camera inside it with a flash and grab a picture of the criminal inside, or can you kind of run down the street after someone coming to court that day? And I thought, actually, no, I can't do that. So I thought, well, I should go back to university and study photography. And I turned up for the first day at a course that I signed up for, and I just thought, I can't go back to university. So I decided the only way forward was to try and get a job somehow in photography. And my first job was for a small magazine called Progressive Newsagent, which, believe it or not, there were magazines for newsagents all about what you could sell in a newsagent. I couldn't believe such a magazine existed, but they needed a staff photographer. So I took that job. And as a result of that, I had a bit of money in my pocket, and I started to frequent, I moved to London, started to go to more exhibitions, galleries, and then I discovered the photo bookshop at the Photographer's Gallery, which at that point was not in the location it is now. It's this tiny little bookshop, and it was like this amazing resource of what was going on in photography. And this is where I discovered this book by Alex Webb, which was an absolute seminal work of colour reportage, which made me realise that there were more possibilities in photography than I could have ever imagined. And during this period, I then got a job at the agency Network Photographers, and I was very fortunate to work with some very, very highly committed photojournalists, and I started to consume more and more photo books when I could afford them. It was normally one a month at that time, so 12 a year. And I started to slowly build a collection of books that I thought were the most exciting thing I'd ever seen in photography. And this is another one by Alex Webb on Haiti, Harry Grier's book on Morocco. And I went to Morocco at this time and tried to sort of emulate Grier, and I suddenly realized that at this stage in my career it was always going to be about copying other photographers. Could I copy someone? Could I make images like that person or that photographer? And I think when you're starting out in your career, that's a perfectly acceptable way to go, because it helps you hone your technique and understand what the way of looking at the world is from this photographer's perspective. It may not be your perspective at that time, but it certainly is a perspective. And this is another book by Grier that I purchased at that time. And then I went to the Magnum in Our Time exhibition, and I think that was around about this time, 91. And again, there was this like explosion of excitement about the possibility of what photography could do. but there was also other things going on in photo books that kind of caught my attention. Nick Watlington did this fantastic book on two families in Nottingham he spent, I think, his final year at college at Nottingham Trent just embedding himself in this family and produced this wonderful book. So there was also Paul Rees was working in colour in a different way at that time. This was going on in the background for me because I was still very much kind of buying books that were kind of by the traditional masters, Salgado's, Other Americas. Tony Ray Jones had an exhibition at Photographic gallery. So this was kind of something I kind of thinking, this is great, but I don't quite know why. And then Mark Ribboot. A lot of these books were also purchased in remainder bookshops on the Charing Cross Road. You could pick up books for like £10, £15, because basically I got the feeling maybe that no one was buying them, and they printed too many. Then they were purchased by companies who would remainder them and resell them on. So at that time, it was quite a vibrant time for buying cheaper photography books that were still very beautiful. So I kind of left Network Photographers after a couple of years and thought, I was beginning to explore colour and energy in a way that I'd kind of seen in the books that I had purchased at that time. And then my wife and I decided to quit our jobs and go to Central America for 6 months. And I thought, right, this is it. This is when I'm going to become that kind of photojournalist that I wanted to be. But there was something about the kind of photo story approach that I didn't quite have, couldn't quite get my head into. And we traveled from San Francisco all the way through to San Jose, all the way through Mexico and Central America. Film was quite expensive then. I was shooting on Kodachrome 64. So I managed to kind of scrape some money together for about 150 rolls of Kodachrome. Kodachrome is quite hard to shoot with, but when you get it right, and these are dodgy scans, so I apologize for these. This is Guatemala, Mexico, and the influences of Webb and Grier are quite clear here. But that's okay, because I was just learning my craft at this point. This is Guanajuato in Mexico. Apologies. This is the Solola market in Guatemala. And because I'd studied politics, and I specialized in Latin American politics in my third year, I knew that the history of Guatemala was pretty desperate, and they've been having a civil war for the last 15 years or so. And I wanted to convey some of the menace and undercurrent of kind of tension and violence that had been prevalent in these places, and suddenly realized that maybe this was what I could do. Rather than do a photo story on a subject, I could try and convey a kind of mood, and the whole collection of pictures came together in the end as sort of Under the Volcano, I think, or Into the Zocalo, which is the main square. So I started just shooting photographs in the main squares or gathering places of all the towns we passed through, and built together this body of photographs from that time. I took it to Thames and Hudson thinking, great, they're going to publish all of it. I got a lovely polite rejection letter at the time and moved on. But at the same time, I was shooting black and white, and this in the square format on a Mamiya C330 camera. And this opened up a different style of photography, much quieter. This is in Huehuetenango. So he's a evangelical Christian, and this was quite significant shooting with this camera, because I couldn't afford to shoot color transparency in in the medium format. So I bought a bunch of black and white film and took it with me. And I think some of the images here are beginning to feel a bit more like my pictures rather than somebody else's, which is a journey every photographer goes on in the development of their sort of stylistic approach. And so this was 1994, we got back from that trip. I got back, I was working as a typist in a housing association in order to earn money. It's very kind of was late 20s at that time. And I got a call from Magnum Photos and they said, would you like to be our editorial sales manager? And I thought, okay, I actually want to be a photographer, but I'm working as a typist in the housing association. Maybe if I go and work at Magnum with all the people that I, worship, it will be great. And of course, it wasn't a great fit because, I wanted to be a photographer. So I left after 6 months, and my friend at that time, Jonathan, said, look, you can do it, go for it, have another try. So this section is called Starting Over. And so again, books are central to this kind of rediscovery of what I could do as a photographer. So I started again exploring what was going on out there in the world of photography. I was quite late to the party. These books were published in the mid-1980s, but they were basically kind of collections of the color photography that was coming out of America. Sternfeld, Stephen Shaw, Joel Manowitz, they've been working for a long time, but this is the time when it was very difficult to access information. So photo books were definitely the primary source of information if a gallery wasn't showing the work at that time. This is another collection of those color photographers. And then I started looking at more of the American work. And the thing is, when you're young, you don't know about all this stuff. And so when you come across it, it's like when I was a kid, I thought Coca-Cola had been invented the year before. When I saw that, these things have been around a long time, I'd never heard of Diane Arbus. But of course, when the minute you see it, it's like, oh my goodness, what is this? This is fantastic. So again, Lisette Medell, the classics of American photography. But then I found this in the Remainder bookshop in the Charing Cross Roads, £4. And Looking for Love was like, this was what was going on in Britain. And this book by Tom Wood has obviously become a massive classic now. I bought 4 copies for £4 and sold them all a few years later for considerably more. And then bought one back when I regretted selling it. So Tom Wood's, and then Martin had been doing his work on the middle classes. And I'm thinking, okay, how am I going to define who I am and find my own language as a photographer? And it's one of the hardest things to do. So we've got from kind of 1987 to 1995 when I left Magnum. That's 8 years of sort of exploring the photographs of other photographers and thinking, what do I need to do in order to find my own language? So I decided to buy, I think I bought a whole range of different affordable medium format cut color cameras. I switched to color negative film. I decided not to use a flash because if you used the flash, everyone was going to say that you were Martin Parr. And it's like, I thought, well, there's no point in that because he's already got his own language, so I need to find my own. And that's really difficult. So this is what I call the golden years. I'm 57 now. So the golden years are that period in the photographer's life when you've got more energy and time and enthusiasm than you can possibly contain. And you're so obsessed with the possibilities of photography, nothing will get in your way. It's quite an unhealthy period as well, but it also tends to be quite prolific. And so I started going out to events. This is the 1996 England versus Spain semi-final, Euro 96. I think that was the semi-final, could have been the quarterfinal. Anyway, shooting film was expensive even then. It's become prohibitively expensive now. But you could go with like 8 rolls or something, and from that you needed to get some pics. So I started bringing some of the portrait ideas that I had kind of been trying out in Central America, bringing them into the color environment. Diane Arbus had her own particular way of doing things based on her own psychological, issues. I don't have those issues, but I love the directness of her work. So I thought, okay, let's try this direct approach. And I started going out to all kinds of different events. This was the Newbury bypass tree protest. And my friend Jonathan Ollie at the time, he was shooting black and white, 35mm. And I thought, okay, we'll go together, but we're going to do different things. So I took I think I had a Kiev 6.6 Russian camera, which has got one of the worst wind-on mechanisms in the history of cameras. You get through 20 rolls and then it breaks and you have to buy a new body. So, but, I eventually purchased a Rolleiflex in the end, which kind of helped me through. And then I was beginning to get sort of assignments as a photographer, but nothing kind of really major. Just, working for the trade magazines. Nursing Times would give you a job every week. Health Service Journal, Doctor Magazine, all the little magazines just to make a living. And by this time I had a young son as well, so I had to try and make some money. And then my daughter came along, and that added to the kind of responsibilities. So it's like I started pitching ideas to magazines, things I'd seen on my commercial assignments. So I'd worked for the Picture and Piano bar chain. They'd asked me to photograph some recruitment pictures of their staff. And as a result of that, I ended up behind the bar working with them. And then I saw all these scenes that you only see them if you're a bar person. And I'd seen a kind of series by Marianne and Mark on singles bars, which had this kind of same kind of vibe going on from behind the bar. So I thought, this is good. There's something going on here. So this is a series of pictures of me from the perspective of the barman. And I began to, you can see the influences of Tom Wood here. Clearly, it's like, but I'm still trying to find my own way. I'll show you a few other photos from this time. This was a series of pictures I did on the national park system. And these were ideas that I proposed to magazines about Britain, and they started to buy into this way of working, which was great. This was at V2000 festival. This is actually a Virgin Mobile promotion, a kind of promotionary stunt. The colour kind of influences of Sternfeld coming through, but then applying them to kind of the British landscape as well. So I was going everywhere and anywhere, taking my camera out. If someone would pay me, that's great. If they didn't, that's fine. This is Canvey Island, Ascot. This is a football match at Clapham Common. I did a series of, by about year 2000, the magazine commissioned 6 photographers to do a series of work on British summertime, and I chose to do different summer jobs. So this was a fruit picker in Kent. This is a pylon painter. They can only do it in the summer for obvious reasons. This is a young girl selling stuff at a festival. A little bit of flash sneaking in there. This is again at Newbury. So this is quite a prolific period, and I pitched the idea of going to Los Angeles to a magazine. Nobody was interested. We've seen it all before, Venice Beach, blah, blah, blah. I went anyway. I just got the cheapest ticket I could buy, and spent a whole week, just literally 14 hours a day, walking up and down Venice Beach. And this lady apparently was quite famous for obvious reasons. And some of the kind of the 35mm way of working, it was quite interesting to go back to that. Some of the kind of influences of Alex Webb were creeping back, but that's fine. But I was interested in the street characters. And this another shot. And in the end, a magazine purchased the set of pictures, and Time Out guides bought some pictures, and so I managed to make a decent profit out of that trip. So I mean, this was in the days when magazines would pay you a couple of £1,000 for a kind of bought-in feature, and they would pay up to £4,000 for an assignment. So, you know, I'm not sure that those rates exist anymore, but at that time you could pitch ideas and make a decent profit. I went to Miami for 4 days for a client who wanted me to shoot something, but I shot my own film on the side. I also was interested in shop fronts. This was at the Golden Jubilee, I think. When would that have been? 2002. So I was working often I'd be working on one assignment for a trade magazine or a commercial client, and I would always carry my camera with me because they ultimately allowed you to go to places that otherwise you wouldn't go. So it would be a massive wasted opportunity not to be looking around before the shoot or after the shoot for picture opportunities. This was in a suburb of Ipswich was called California, and I did a small feature on that for a magazine. The great thing about Google Street is you can now revisit the places you shot and see what they look like now. This is actually still a chemist, but it sadly isn't promoting Old Spice in the same way. Some of these pictures I'm showing you because they are going to emerge 25 years later into my book Memory Lane, and I just wanted to kind of contextualize how they kind of sporadically came together. There wasn't some kind of coherent idea that I was going to have a book about a particular subject at that time. It was just gathering together things that I found interesting, and this was in Scarborough, and it was shot. And so let's get back to photo books. There's this wonderful shop in Judd Street in London run by Bill and Jasper. And it was, I mean, it looks a bit like Diagon Alley from Harry Potter or something. It was this kind of haven of you could go there and quietly browse. They'd never harass you. They'd often show you what's just come in. You never knew what was going to be on the shelves. And you always wanted to go there to if you were in town, just to see what was available. And you could never leave the shop without something in a bag. And this shop, I think, was transformative in my life, I think, because for some bizarre reason, when I went inside, I felt really safe. I can't explain it. There's something about books and shelves and this, I mean, there's something about that, the magical little shop. And we would always chat for hours, and sadly, Bill became ill and Jasper couldn't run the shop on his own, and it shut about 10, 15 years ago now, I think. But I found this picture on the internet and I thought, oh, and I shared it recently with people and said, does this bring back any feelings to people? And they all would think, oh, I remember that little shop. And so I had a little bit more money, but no more shelf space. But I started buying a few things. Unfortunately, I spilled red wine on Gossage and Richtenbach's Snake Eyes. You know, books by photographers I'd never heard of. Books by photographers that weren't, fully recognised at the time. Others that were kind of godfathers of photography in America. British photography, Eggleston I kind of discovered at that time. And this was working alongside my commercial work. So these are some of it's all interrelated. The photography books, the looking, the finding, the uncovering of the possibilities of photography, in a pre-internet era was, you know, it was very hard to find out information, as I've said before, and it all started to come together. And these are some of the assignments that I did at the time. This was the end of the Pier show at Cromer, where I spent 3 days photographing the performers there. And the writer for the magazine went on a separate day and apparently got drunk and managed to make up an act that wasn't actually in the performance at all. So the poor people who ran the show were absolutely mortified. And the director of the show said to me, well, it'll be chip paper tomorrow, so let's just leave it at that. And I felt quite uncomfortable about that. But this image here, one of the Simmons brothers attached to a rope from the roof, actually occurs in my book many years later. So this was one of the spreads, and here's the bar feature. Now, I always wondered what this young woman thought about herself being on the front cover of a magazine, and 22 years later I put that picture on Instagram and I said, I wonder where she is now. And literally a minute later someone says, I know where she is, I'm married to her brother. And I was in contact with her straight away, and she'd actually ordered a copy of the magazine. She said it reminded her of her kind of excitable and interesting youth. But now it's like, could you take that picture and shove it on the cover of a magazine? I'm not sure you could. I'm not sure I would. But I was very pleased to hear all these years later that she was perfectly happy with that picture being used. And you know, I was beginning to get more assignments, and I would take any opportunity to get a picture. So this portrait of Tony Blair was taken in Downing Street for Unions Today magazine, who paid £100 for an assignment. But I obviously grabbed the opportunity to go, and his press officer at the time, it may have been Alistair Campbell, I don't know. I took 2 frames and they told me to put my cameras down. So I literally sulked, sitting on cross-legged on the floor of the Downing Street office. And Blair turned to me and said, what's the problem? I said, this guy won't let me do my job. And Blair said, oh no, carry on, it's fine, no worries. And I got this rather good portrait of him in his sort of full magisterial manner. I got assignments. I started to get assignments from kind of, this was for the Central Office of Information. So you can see the sort of reportage style that I was using was now beginning to be used for commercial purposes. This was a shoot for a hospital I did. And as a result of this assignment, I've had a kind of connection with the NHS and hospital work for over 20 years. And I'm currently shooting some video for a couple of trusts at the moment. So it's funny how once you kind of find a kind of vein. So this was for a small healthcare trust at the time, just bringing together some of the kind of quirky ideas that I had into a commercial setting. There's a few more spreads. This is how the LA work was used, the LA work that they didn't want, which no one would pay for. But this image here on the left of the plastic alien, the number of people that asked me if that was a real person. It's bizarre to think. Yeah, it led to quite a lot of interest from advertising agencies in my work. And I'm going to go on to that in a second. So this was this couple of days I spent in California, suburb of Ipswich. So turn up with a Rolleiflex and some film, get some pictures, and a couple of these images survived and made it into memory lane. And this picture here was a significant turning point in my fortunes as a photographer. The picture on the left is a donkey on the beach in Barmouth. And by the way, on Instagram, someone got in touch with me and said, oh, I can date this picture from the hand-painted sign. It's pre-2000 when we changed the signs to a different sign. And I had a conversation with the woman who still works on that beach today. But someone tore this picture out of a magazine and kept it, and she was an art buyer at TBWA, one of the big ad agencies in London, and she basically phoned me up 2 years later and called me in for a job, which I didn't get, but said, "Oh, you should go and see this very prestigious photo agent at the time, and they might be interested in your work." And they were, and they took me on around about 2001, and within a matter of months, I was shooting ads for. Look at those phones. Talking about dating the pictures. But suddenly what happened was the pictures that I made for myself, people liked them. They had their drawings, their ideas of what they wanted to do, and they wanted to apply what I did to their commercial needs at a very high level. It's, each of these photos to set up and cast and prop, it's probably about £10,000 to £15,000. You know, we had to rent Crystal Palace football stadium for this one, a cafe in Soho for that. For the guy on the German, they said all the Germans have to have mullet hair. It's like, yeah, but this is early 2000s, no one does. So we managed to, we basically had to put wigs on these people. The guy with his painted face there was my friend and assistant Ty Devlin, who he said it took about 3 hours to get that paint off his face, and I don't think he's forgiven me now. But there were lots of jobs coming through for train companies for wanting my way of doing things, and it was very lucrative, but it was incredibly stressful. And I did this for about 4 years, 5 years. This is, you know, someone's idea of a good ad campaign. I wrote my children into the work at the time. I went to all-time lows in terms of advertising. Apparently picking your nose and eating it quenches your hunger, as does this yogurt drink. I actually made that bogey out of Copperdex and green paint an hour before the crew turned up. This is the first venturing into digital manipulation, so clearly the young lad is not suckling a Great Dane, but Photoshop was coming into its own at this time. And so I gave up advertising, and it's like, I think advertising gave me up as well. And so that was the end of that. And we moved house. I kind of thought, maybe that's it with photography now. If this is the kind of pinnacle of where it ends, then I'm going to go and do something else. And I started a video company and kind of left photography as a primary income behind. So we're talking 2005. So we've gone on a journey from black and white photos in India to people suckling Great Danes. And it didn't feel like it was like the place that it should be. So I started again, and I started a video company. But meanwhile, my interest and passion for photo books continued. And this is a picture of my daughter drew of me quite recently, and it sort of indicates where my head was at for quite a few years. This library, I'll come back to later. This is the Fantasy Library. This belonged to Manfred Heiting in America, one of the world's greatest photo book collectors. And at this time, there was a lot of books coming out about photo books. And I thought, well, okay, I always loved photo books. Why don't I start collecting and building a kind of canon of books? And by the way, there is no such thing as a canon. A canon is what's considered the ultimate sort of representation of the history of either literature or photography books, but it's constantly shifting. So there isn't truly a canon. But these books were kind of coming out saying, well, this is interesting. So the internet, that's where I spent. The Photo Book International is shut. I'm on the internet. I'm looking at auctions all the time of key books in the canons. I'm looking at the crazy prices that some books are going for, thousands, you know. I'm looking at Eastern European photo books. I'm looking at the difference between a signed copy of Decisive Moment of £6,000. I don't have that kind of money. Here we are. Here's a brilliant example of On the right is a really overpriced bad copy of Decisive Moments for £400. On the left is the Steidl facsimile that came out for £70. I would advise always buying a facsimile. You can buy the kind of not the original version of the Europeans with more pictures in, or you can buy the original. That one you can get on the internet now for £10. This one will cost you 850 quid in that condition. So the whole thing about photo book collecting is if you get into the prestigious rare stuff, you need to have deep pockets. And so I kind of looked at this and realized that a signed copy of Ansel Adams' book at $9,800, that was for other people, that wasn't for me. So I just started building a collection of what I could afford and what space that we had, and now we've officially run out of space. So here's just a quick overview of some of the books that I collected, of which there are about 1,000 now. So these are some quite nice ones. So you've got facsimile of Paris there, you've got facsimile of Photoage. We remade a cover for De Welteschon. You know, some of this stuff is quite expensive. Krull was reissued as a facsimile, the metal book there, that would cost you 25,000 if you want the original. Why buy the original when you can buy a facsimile? So I'm just going to take you through, this is, sorry, cities. So I started collecting under themes. I always bought the best condition I could, because that tends to be books that hold their value. But some books I bought for a tenner or even a couple of pounds. So it's not all about how much the book is worth. Some are worth more than others. So I started collecting quite ferociously over a sort of 15-year period. Spent far too long on the internet and realized that this is a whole collection of corporate photography books that I decided that with research were kind of seminal works. There's a wonderful book by Margaret Bork-White called Newsprint, which is on a paper company in America in the late 30s. It's just unbelievable. I would show you all the interiors, but we don't have time. So just collecting these books became an activity of stress relief, to be honest. It was a way of spending time alone, shed activity. It was both relaxing and exciting in the same, but it wasn't the same as when I was a young man, going to the photo gallery bookshops or going to Photobooks International. Somehow it felt more obsessive and more kind of, but it was also building together a collection of books that I enjoy very much. So let me take you to this picture. We're back in Manfred's library. These are the books that made it to the Texas Museum of Modern Art, I believe. These are the books that were burnt in the fires of Malibu about 5 years ago, I think. The whole collection was completely destroyed in about 3 hours. Now, obviously, many people died in those fires, so, you know, it's not comparable, but there was something about that moment to me was that this has got to stop now. You've got enough books. So my daughter produced this digital facsimile of what I'd actually put together in different corners of the house. And then I realized that there isn't really, it's constantly changing what is relevant and what's important in photography publishing. And this wonderful book's just come out about how many overlooked books there have been in the history of photography. And in the introduction, it suggests that maybe we need to completely start all over again. And this book by Justine Kurland has said exactly that. She's cut up all her photo books by white heterosexual men and turned them into collages. And she said, right, that's it now. We're going to have a new history. I'm aware that I've only got 15 minutes left, which is quite scary. So lockdown, enough of collecting. Let's start looking at my own pictures again after a 20-year period. started have time to sort of look at all the work again, look at the book dummies I put together, started printing some of the work I'd done. My daughter said, "You need to get on Instagram, Dad, that's where it's happening now." So I did, and I noticed that lots of people were uploading photos of their photo book collections on Instagram, and there was a community of people sharing ideas and thoughts. I was a big fan of Lars Tunbjork, and he published this book called Winter, and there was a photo in there that Matt Stewart, the street photographer, shared of and I said, "Look, I'm a massive fan of this book. Did you know that the picture of the open heart surgery is actually Tunbjork himself, who subsequently died shortly afterwards of a heart attack?" And we set up a conversation, and Matt said, "Oh, I've got this new publishing company called Plague Press, and I'd love to see some of your work." And then I put this on Instagram. He said, "Oh, I know who you are. I used to collect the magazines in the 90s, and I remember this series from the cover of The Independent. Have you got any more pictures?" So over a period of 6 months, we with the help of Tom Booth Woodger, the book designer, we chose 64 pictures, or 63, I can't remember, to be honest, of the best work from what I would call the golden years. And I'm going to show you some of these images now from memory lane. And I deliberately don't tell you anything about them, but there's only one thing I am going to tell you about this van, which was that it was involved in a chase by another ice cream van. It went through the villages of North Wales shortly after this picture was taken, went under a bridge, the hat was knocked off, and it was a write-off. But that's the only story. The rest are just, this is in Macclesfield, Great Yarmouth. Again, Great Yarmouth. Hyde Park. Redcar. Bolton. Dulwich Park in London. Redcar. Harrow on the Hill. His name's Roger, that's all I know. He was on his way to an interview. This is in Doncaster. This is in Harrow as well. And this is in Ingold Mells near Skegness. And this is in Hoxton in London. And this is in Bridlington, which I thought was Cleethorpes, but just before the book was published, I checked the contact sheets and it wasn't, it was Bridlington, and we changed the caption in time. So the book was published after 25 years really of, on from the gold, 20 years on from the gold period. Matt very kindly put the money up and published Memory Lane, which was a collection of the best work from what I would call my golden years. And I'm going to end on this because something weird happened once the book had been published. This is the first image in the book that Tom had chosen. It was a young child in Lingfield in Sussex, with the mother in this ancient pram. And I went home and I dug through the family albums in my mum's cupboard and I found this photo album called Memory Lane. I'd completely forgotten about it, but obviously unconsciously I must have remembered the name of this album, because this was the one with all the pictures of me as a kid. And then I looked through it, and then staring back at me was my junior self staring at the camera quite intently. And as you can notice, I'm wearing reins because I was quite an unruly little boy, I think, maybe. But anyway, I felt that was a really wonderful, cathartic closing of a circle. I was going to go on to what's next, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to say I'm still shooting on these two. I'm shooting film. I'm still going around the coasts. These are some images that I've recently shot on Instagram. which is where you can see most of my work and my website as well. And I think we'll leave it there because this is what's coming now. If I've still got it in me, I'm not sure, but this is probably where my head is at right now. So if there are any questions, I'm quite happy to stay on, but I think I've overrun by 10 minutes. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. That was quite nostalgic for me, actually, because I think we must have been in each other's footsteps fairly.
Yeah, the old, the analog
90s,
days,
yeah,
definitely.
Do we have any questions from our audience at all? So I've got some that have come in, so I'm going to kick off then. I suppose this is almost a final question, but it's not really the final question. About what happens to that book collection? Is it something you're going to recycle, or is it going to go somewhere?
Yeah. So at the moment, the plan is that it will. I've got someone working with me to find a buyer for the entire collection. The idea is that it will go into the public domain rather than into the hands of a private collector. That's more difficult because it means that someone has to buy it on behalf of an organisation. But we're kind of investigating that. That would be the ideal position, would be for it to go in as a resource for other people to access. I mean, the danger is that the temptation would be to split it up and sell off the individual items one by one. I don't have it in me to spend that amount of time on the internet again, reselling everything. So it will find a home, but it will be leaving our home next year, hopefully, and be shared for others to access.
Wonderful, thank you. So we've got a question here from Tag asking, what website blog would you recommend to look for contemporary books? Okay, so the big place at the moment is Katawiki, which is a kind of Dutch auction site, which is where every week they have up to 4 photo book auctions a week, and you can sort of you can get into some bidding wars there if you're not careful. So I advise you not to do that. Problem now is postage. That's absolutely killing the photo book buying world because of Brexit. It's really expensive to post to the UK now. So postage used to be like £7, now 28, £30 for a book. So yeah, the best place to find photo books still is probably AB Books, but they're owned by Amazon now. But maybe the best thing to do is to start a fresh start with all the new contemporary books that are coming out, because a lot of the older books are seriously overpriced now and people are charging silly money. So my advice for buying photo books now would be to go to websites like Photo Bookstore or Beyond Words Books. Come to actual physical places like the RPS, browse, come to Bop.
Yes, exactly. Come to Bop
in October.
Yeah, and invest in the new photographers that are coming through. Yeah.
There's a lot to be said for that, actually.
Yeah,
new work. So Carolyn Mendelssohn, firstly, is really just commenting, saying she loved to see your journey, influences, and how your career progressed. So interesting. So thank you, Carolyn.
Very much.
What else we got here? So comment from Carl saying, I know you said you wouldn't get into it, but what is the future for you? Can't help but wonder.
Oh, thank you. Well, okay, just briefly, the coastal work on the edge is probably going to be finished next year. And Carl, I know you've been kind of quite supportive of that in terms of how I should put it together. And we're looking at releasing that as zines, because books now are hugely expensive to produce. Paper costs have gone through the roof. Ink, Memory Lane would now cost 30% more to produce than it did even 18 months ago. So we're looking at short run digital print runs, maybe 50 to 100, that people can afford to buy, £10 a copy, that kind of price. But substantial, what I call magazines. So and looking at companies like Mixam, some of the print quality now is really good if you get your initial uploads in a good state. But I'm also returning to some work I did in the Himalayas, where a valley called Zanskar, which I've been visiting for the last 30 odd years. but it's very much a collaboration with younger local photographers sharing work that they're doing. So using the work that I did originally as a kind of inspiration and talking point for work that they're doing now. So very much about collaboration. I've been shooting London at night for the last 20 years, and I still enjoy it when the winter comes. It keeps me sane actually in the dark winters. So I think something might zine happen with that. Dorking, I've been shooting for 20 years. That's coming to an end. Little zines, so you can go to Paris, you can produce a zine, a magazine, but you know, for very little money, and you can share them. But the most exciting thing is something I'm going to do with another photographer called Ed Sykes. In the 1960s, Stalinstadt, which was the first communist city ever built in Eastern Europe, so it's on the border of it's in East Germany and Poland border. It's now renamed Eisenhüttenstadt for obvious reasons. Was twinned with Crawley in Sussex for 5 or 6 years. There was a weird twinning program that went on in the 60s between East German towns and English towns, which I discovered. I had a couple of books on Stalinstadt, and Ed and I spent a lovely day last week in Crawley Town Centre thinking, how can we bring this alive as an idea? And the idea was that we were thinking of retwinning Stalinstadt, Eisenhüttenstadt and Crawley online and sharing lots of photographs between the different places, either historically or contemporary. And maybe we'll make some pictures ourselves. Maybe we won't, but if we do, I'll be shooting on this, which is my new Graflex Super D shoots. It's the only SLR 5.4 that was ever made, and it's a wonderful camera. And I'll be shooting in black and white, which I may hand color myself. I don't know, but if not, I'll be shooting on a tiny little Canon and my trusty Rolleiflex. So that's where it's going. Just simple, inclusive, collaborative ideas, and let's see what happens.
So we've got a couple more questions from Zoom as well, which I'm going to monopolise your time for.
Yeah.
Just asking, so a question here asking, from Paula asking, which Instagram sites you're following and which do you really love? Okay, so yeah, Instagram took up a huge amount of my time, and for good reason. It's like the ultimate resource for finding out what's going on with photographers. I was following thousands of accounts and realised that that's not possible to do, because your feed is just filling with people's content, and it's just impossible to keep up with. And it felt very disloyal to unfollow people when they followed you, but the reality is you haven't got the time or the mind, to do it. So I'm not going to name any specific names, but if you go to my Instagram and see who I'm following, those are the people that I'm following right now. So and for anyone I've unfollowed, it's nothing personal. It's just that I simply haven't got the brain power to process all those images. And then the question, going back to those books you were buying in the 80s yes. and 90s, and asking what you think those books taught you or showed you. Okay, so yeah, the thing about a book is it's got to be about something. So you've got kind of greatest hits books where photographers, they've got their best work, but that isn't necessarily a coherent body of work. The Decisive Moment by Cartier-Bresson is not actually officially a photo book. It's a book of greatest hits that sort of was a photo book, but it isn't particularly a coherent narrative about a particular subject. So Looking for Love, for example, is an amazing book because it's about one club in New Brighton where Tom Wood went like every week for 4 years or something. And from that came this amazing body of work. So I think one thing that I learned from collecting photo books is when Matt and Tom came to tell me to throw away from the edit hundreds of pictures that I loved, and that we ended up with a coherent narrative. I think that's what I learned from collecting books, is that is the hardest thing to end up with, is a meaningful
kind of story or kind of narrative in your work, and you've got to be able to let go of some of your greatest hits, even if you think that they're better photographs. It's tough, but I'm glad we managed to do that. And Memory Lane for me is totally coherent. It's about a misremembered Britain. I mean, it's the Britain that we kind of thought was Britain. It's very difficult to kind of explain that in more detail, but ultimately, I believe that Brexit is a result of a misremembered past that never existed in the first place, and now we're paying the price of it, especially if you're buying photo books from Castlewiki and you can't afford the postage anymore.
Which probably brings us very neatly to the end. There's some other questions and some very nice comments from people that we'll share with you afterwards.
Yeah.
But, firstly, thank you for sharing that and for showing some wonderful images, nostalgic, but also very thoughtful as well. Thank you to our audience, and thank you to our Zoom audience as well for your questions and your engagement this evening. Come to BOP in the second weekend in October in Bristol with the RPS and Martin Parr Foundation. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing everyone at the next talk in this series. So thank you, and thanks to Tom Broadbent too, especially for arranging this series of talks and for arranging the books outside in the front of house area.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Thanks very much. Thank you. Well, thanks for coming, guys. It's amazing how